Okay, good morning, everyone. If you're in Western North America, for everybody else around the world, hello, and welcome to the 2021 edition of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. The 16th season of the Speaker Series will be presented in a brand new format, due in large part to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will now be live streaming the presentations as a series of weekly webinars. This technological leap is made possible in large part thanks to the generous support of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Cooperating Society. So to kick off the new season, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its Cooperating Society are proud to present Dr. Michael MacKinnon. Michael is a professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada. Michael received bachelor's degrees in biology and anthropology from the University of Toronto. He then moved to Edmonton to pursue a master's degree and a PhD in anthropology at the University of Alberta. Subsequently, Michael spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Archaeology at Boston University in the United States, and then 1 year as a Rome scholar at the British School in Rome, Italy. Michael's field of specialty is zooarchaeology, which is the reconstruction of the role of animals in Greek and Roman antiquity based on the analysis of animal remains found at archaeological sites. He has participated in more than 60 different archaeological projects around the world in countries like Italy, Sicily, Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Turkey, Romania, Portugal, Spain, Egypt, and Tunisia, and has conducted research at several famous locations like Pompeii, Rome, Carthage, Athens, and Alexandria, just to name just a few. So today, Michael will present an overview of his research on what can be inferred about pet care in ancient Rome based on the study of archaeological faunal remains. So without further delay, it is with a great pleasure that I present to you, Dr. Michael MacKinnon. So Michael, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Francois. I'm going to share the screen now to start the show. So as noted, I'm what's called a zooarchaeologist. So I take animal bones and reconstruct aspects of antiquity from those. So it's kind of like dinosaur stuff, although the things I work with are more recent, they're less fossilized, and they're from a cultural domain. So their humans are involved as well. Start with a quotation, and I just pulled this from the internet, I admit, but I think it captivates some of the emotional attention that animals share with humans. So this is from the French author Anatole France, who wrote, "Until one has loved an animal, a part of one's soul remains unawakened." And this particular author won a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1921, but I think it's sort of a message that resounds across time and space and generations, that there's something kind of emotional and something where pets connect and pull at our heartstrings, and that this is not something that's just today, but could transcend time and space. So images with animals certainly linked to our emotions. There's a strong reflection of animals, that they tell something about us. And certainly as archaeologists, it's incumbent upon us to then reconstruct those roles of animals in antiquity, and how they tug at human emotions and really are important for reconstructions of all aspects of human life. So in the world of classical archaeology in which I'm immersed, certainly more attention has been given to the artifacts, the pots, the temples, the architecture, and certainly those are important for our reconstructions of those domains of antiquity. But I think that bones are also artifacts. They tell us not only about the biological world, the ecological world, but also about the cultural world, about humans. So as a zooarchaeologist, our principal goal is to reconstruct the living assemblage. So which animals were around, how they were used. Those ones are going to die, so we call that the death assemblage. And then they might be cooked or processed or used for different purposes. So a subsample of the death assemblage becomes this cooked and processed assemblage. And then we throw out their remains, and humans make choices about which things they throw out, where they might throw them. Those will subsequently get buried in the ground, and then archaeologists come along and dig up a subsample of those. So kind of in the same world of those working in paleontology. You're dealing with small bits of things for which you have to work as a sort of detective in that backward process to reconstruct from those small fossilized remains, or zooarchaeological assemblages in my case, to which animals are around and how are they used by the people of that time. Luckily for classical antiquity, we can work with the bones, the things we collect from these sites, and we can add information from the ancient textual sources. We have history, poetry, mythology, encyclopedia volumes that were written from the viewpoint of different authors in antiquity, epics, legends, and then all of the art where we have frescoes, mosaics, sculptures, images of the animals. We want to work with all three of these because they provide evidence for our reconstructions, which with using all three, we can hopefully get a more complete reconstruction of the ancient life. So today I'm going to concentrate with how we might use these lines of evidence, in particular the bones, to get at that aspect of what is a pet and how were pets treated or viewed, and how did they factor in the world of Greek and, well, more so Roman antiquity. So our first thing is what's a pet overall, and this could be a tricky concept, and certainly our notions of what we call and how we order, think of a pet today might not fit neatly into the world of antiquity. Certainly simply by naming an animal, we might say then we've called it a pet because we've given it some humanizing features. We might memorialize it, venerate it, care for it. But certainly there's a connection of humans, in a lot of cases, treating, caring, maybe going out of their way to help, assist, love an animal, which can lead to changes in the animals themselves and records in the archaeological record itself that tell us about this care and duty and connection that people share. So we'll explore different varieties of pets, and we'll concentrate mostly with dogs because they have more evidence from our archaeological vantage. But let me start with cats. I'm more of a dog person. I don't want to offend the cat people in the audience, but cats and their bones do show up from ancient sites. Cats get connected mostly with Egyptian archaeology. So cats were magical creatures. They were thought to bring good luck. They were protected and venerated. And most of the cats, in terms of our artistic evidence in our bones and even cat mummies, derive from Egyptian times. So dynastic times in the 20th and 19th century BC were highlight points for cats in the world of Egyptian archaeology. They were protected by the Egyptians. So because they were so well venerated, they didn't really travel much outside of Egypt. As antiquity pursued and the Greeks kind of overcame aspects of Egypt and the Romans conquered it later on, we see cats then moving out of Egypt and becoming more commonplace across the Mediterranean. So into the 8th, 7th, 5th, and 4th century BCs, they start to spread more around the Mediterranean. In Roman times, certainly into the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, we see cats show up at a few sites. They're talked about in the text, they're depicted in the art. The playfulness, the curiosity, the agility is remarked upon, but they're not really considered pets. Most of these cats were more so working animals in terms of going after mice, getting rid of vermin, and that kind of sort of the barnyard cat that we might think of today. Their bones do show up among some archaeological sites in Roman times, but really at a small fraction of our overall percentages. So 0.2% of the bones from Roman archaeological sites belong to cats. And a couple of things, certainly they're not so common. As we look across the Mediterranean, cats are everywhere today, but back in antiquity, they were less common. Cats are independent, solitary, so often if they're dying or they feel they're dying, they like to hide and move away. So some of that nature of the cat being moved away itself limits it from showing up in the archaeological record. They're wanderers in that respect. They like to die in a place that's far away, that's not going to be part of our archaeological deposits per se. Birds do show up across archaeological sites, and they're mentioned in the text and depicted in art. Birds had multiple roles, as for meat, feathers, eggs. They were hunted. They had lots of roles in magic and augury, so looking at the insides of the birds, different omens of how they were flying. So they had multiple types of roles in antiquity. And certainly there were birders in the past who just were mesmerized and like to just watch these birds in gardens and see them in nature, as many birders do today. From a pet vantage point, we do get notions of sometimes pet partridges. So these weren't really pets in terms of, you know, cuddling them and keeping them, but more pets that were used sort of as a decoy to allure in other prey. So they would be controlled, domesticated to a certain degree for that purpose of being a decoy to pull in other animals. We do get some stories of pet myna birds, crows, jays, parrots, you know, the ones that can mimic voice, and even some accounts of kind of crazy antics. And it was like a silly sitcom episode of this bird says something naughty and the people laugh. So there are some of these tales of kind of anecdotal stories of their loving pet bird who said something silly at some dinner party. Roosters were also important for cockfighting, so they would be trained to fight one another. And the ancient art and stories talk about that pugnacious character, these birds fighting one another. They're described in the ancient texts and also depicted a lot on our iconography, our images. So overall, birds, in particular the domestic fowl, are important in the zooarchaeological record and do show up. It's difficult to know if these were pet birds per se, under more control, named, as we might have a pet chicken in our backyard that eventually becomes the dinner when we're looking for a roast chicken dinner that night. So birds linked with pet becomes a difficult type of thing to piece out from the zooarchaeological record per se. How about things like snakes, reptiles, amphibians? Well, we do get mention of tortoise and frogs and other animals that do show up in the zooarchaeological record. Again, it's difficult to say if they were pets per se. Pet snakes are one thing that are more common in the visual record and in the textual record. So the ancients had some kind of connection with snakes. Some of this is a fascination with their venom that often gets used in medicinal purposes. Asclepius, the Roman god of healing, is connected with snakes. Some of this could be certainly a connection with the snake and healing. So you want to have that around to be on your good side. And more likely, it's probably these snakes are there to impress individuals. A big, large snake slithering around the house is going to evoke, attention from some and fear and awe from others. So again, there's this idea of this animal kept as a pet per se, and if it's not domesticated fully, and it's there for impressing other people. There's a social status connected with it. How about fish? Did they keep fish as pets? Well, perhaps. Our representations of fish in artwork are plentiful, and the Romans, even in some of the wealthier ones, could keep their own private fish ponds or piscine here at their villa complex or at their important sort of mansion-style houses. There are some references to some of those fish in those ponds being named, in which case we can perhaps call them pets, but these are rare, and that connection of just sort of your regular run-of-the-mill fish as a pet, as we might keep a fish tank today, isn't quite on the same connection for us. There is some mention of, though, dolphins aren't technically fish, they're aquatic creatures, they're mammals, but they're the most frequently depicted type of aquatic thing. And certainly it could be the dolphins, I suppose, connection, its intelligence, it's sort of this captivating animal And we get some stories, even Pliny the Elder, who's an ancient encyclopedia author, recounts the story of a pet dolphin that died of a broken heart after its owner, a young boy, had died. So we're moving into this realm of pets and humans connected, in this case, a dolphin, and that bond being so strong that once the boy died, the dolphin died as well. So it's pulling at our heartstrings. It's getting into that more emotional connection that pets could have. Fish bones from the Zooarchaeological record are some sites have many of them, some have very few. Often we have few of them because there's trouble in their recovery. To get at these things, we have to incorporate more wet sieving or more intensive types of recovery procedures, which aren't often used at archaeological sites. So you can see how fish bones could be underrepresented because of the problems in their recovery overall. How about wild animals? They're around wildlife, hares and rabbits and deers and bears, could certainly around in antiquity. Were they tamed in some cases and used as pets or considered as pets? Perhaps, again, much of that would rely upon people taming these things and then incorporating them into that more human domestic realm. And there are cases of people having their own private game preserve outside of their backyard, a forested area where they stock it with animals and they could go off and hunt those things. Some of these might be tamed to the point where the deer would come and feed from their hand, or the rabbits would come. Certainly it's a matter of that human connection in feeding them and taming them. But more often, our references with wild animals are tied up with hunting. And the Romans, or at least the elite, the wealthy Romans who would hunt these animals, wanted that connection of domination over nature. So hunting a tamed animal didn't have quite the cachet of hunting a wild, ferocious bear or a lion or a vicious stag who came after you. So certainly they wanted to keep the wildness in those wild animals in order to promote really that virility and that ferocity and that control over nature, which was so important for Roman philosophy. Finally, we come to dogs. Certainly among the archaeological assemblages of bones, dogs are the most prolific in terms of our pet animals, notwithstanding things like cattle and sheep and goats and pigs, things that were eaten that could also have been considered pets, but were on sort of a different level. They were the things you ate. Dogs weren't consumed in Roman antiquity, so they were considered, in most cases, on that a greater connection could be established for them being pets. And across the lists of things that had been named, the names of animals in antiquity, dogs dominate that list. So they're the pets, I guess, at the highest level, really, across the Roman world. Their roles, certainly we get dogs that were hunting dogs, shepherd dogs, different performing dogs, dogs that could pull little carts. So a variety of different roles that are there for dogs that are mentioned in the ancient sources, as well as depicted in iconography, in images that we have. Among the two most important roles, we could say, for dogs are hunting, certain that dogs would help assist in the hunt, track down prey. And since hunting was an important elite activity, we see it mentioned a lot in the ancient sources. And pets were the other side of that dog coin, where they, we've got a variety of different pets. Certainly your hunting dog could also be a pet dog, but in that world of pet dogs, we see a greater range of sizes and shapes and varieties of these dogs in play for Roman antiquity. Little toy pet breeds are certainly ones that probably didn't serve a purpose beyond being a pet. So toy breeds bring us into this domain of strict pet type animals. and ones too that might kind of engage more with human emotions. Certainly we can see, images of, people today carrying dogs in their little toy dogs in their purse, or Hollywood starlets walking around with dogs here and there. And so that connection become very strong. And it's also the showy marker of a little toy dog being used to brag, I suppose. Small dogs are around in the Greek archaeological record. So before the Romans in 5th century BC, we see images of little toy dogs in the Greek world. And subsequently, Romans are going to take them and breed them and change them and develop them into all sorts of size and shapes and varieties. Among all the dogs that are there, the toy dog ones, the small breeds, are the ones that show up most in terms of some special type of treatment. So we'll talk about this as we move through, but one special type of treatment is a tombstone, where one is invested in expense to venerate, honor the dog in its death afterwards. So toy breeds are the ones that gain more of that type of symbol ultimately. So it then begs the question, what about the care, the treatment of these dogs overall? If one is keeping a dog as a pet, are you going to go over and abhor or outside of your normal routine to treat it well, to feed it well, to take care of it, to love it, to nurture it, things that tie up with your emotional connection with that animal. So dogs do show up across the zooarchaeological record for Roman antiquity. We're going to look at a couple of case studies of dogs that show up at sites and see how they connect with human care and attention. One thing you can do when you gather bones from these sites is you can certainly figure out the breed, the age, the pathologies that might be there. We can look at things in its dentition to get at its diet. So one of the easiest among those things is to measure up these bones and come up with an idea of size variation. So withers heights are really just sort of the height at the shoulder of the animal. It's just this means to kind of parcel animals into size categories. We're going to go through time. So the Neolithic and Bronze Age were before the Greeks, before the Romans. This size range, so think of shoulder heights, 35 centimeters, 55 centimeters is the range for those animals at that time. When we move into the Iron Age, so moving towards Greek antiquity here, you can see that they've bred dogs, or they've changed some of those dimensions to get some larger dogs in the mix as well. So it could be they wanted animals that were more powerful, maybe to help with hunting, or to help with, be stronger in guarding things, or to help in shepherding, moving animals around. So they're breeding, they're changing things, they're manipulating them on the upper end. The Roman end, we see that not only did they make them a little bit bigger, so they're breeding them to get size, larger ones, but if you look at the other end, they're making them smaller. So the Romans, across all our cultures in antiquity, are the ones who invested the most attention to change the breeds, the varieties of dogs that were there. Certainly some that were powerful and helpful, and that whole range of ones that are moving towards the small end, which are really only toy breeds of dogs that don't really serve any great purpose other than to be a pet or for entertainment. So the Romans are the ones who manipulated to get all range of kind of greyhound type, bulldog type, boxer type, Rottweiler type. So where they're manipulating the dimensions, be it I want a long skinny dog with short legs. I want a bulky dog with a short snout. I want a tiny toy dog, you name it. The Romans were the ones who said manipulated breeds to a greater extent than any other culture before them, which we see across the variation in the zooarchaeological record for their sites. How about those tiny ones? Well, Maltese are sort of a breed of small dogs around today. And Maltese are mentioned as a small dog breed in antiquity. Did they arise from the island of Malta? One would want to make that connection, but most likely the name Maltese derives from that island being the sort of a depot area, a trade center where things were shipped out from. So it could be, this isn't the origin spot of Maltese dogs. More likely Maltese dogs were sort of derived from small little Spitz type breeds, often in Central Europe and Southeast Europe. But Malta became known as a spot that could spread out these kinds of things, these kinds of dogs. So a depot spot in which to disseminate small varieties of dogs across the Mediterranean world. When we look at these small breeds, most often in terms of our iconography, our images, they're attached with children. And one wonders, why is this the case? Well, a few things could be here. Could be, well, if I want to display a child, I have to put a small dog with it because small dogs are cute and children are cute. So there perhaps this connection of cute and cute has to come together. Could also be, well, small dogs were a child, in keeping a small dog, mimics his adult equivalent who might keep a larger dog. So small, small, large, large in this case. And as well, this could also be perhaps just some artistic convention that it would look really weird to have a small person with a big dog with it. So there could be some things about registries or how things are depicted in terms of iconography. But nonetheless, child and small dog becomes connected fervently, really, in our artistic evidence for antiquity. Another thing that gets a very solid connection is this idea of dogs, companionship, and social status. So we know today dogs are the fidelity, the symbolic nature of a dog, faithful companion in life and death, that duty, that status marker, that symbolism, well, all those things that we hold today certainly were around in antiquity and could be shown and formalized in our archaeological and zooarchaeological record. So let's take a look at a couple case studies of dogs in those connections and see how this companionship or this linkage, this care, this duty, this special role that dogs played factor. So first, we're going to look at the site called Luniano, which is in Italy. It's just up from the Tiber River, up north of Rome, in Umbria, this province, lovely wine country in Italy today. It's a story that's going to involve dogs. We can't know exactly if these dogs were pets or not, but certainly these dogs had a special ritual connective bond for humans overall. Luniano, the site is a imperial villa, which just means it's a big sort of country house where the Romans had their working farm area. You can see in the images here, there's amphora, there's wine processing, grain, there's the dining area for the farmer and his owner, the villa owner. At the height of this would be in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. Then this wealthy farm complex goes into decline into the 3rd and 4th century AD. Some rooms start to be decay and disused, and then into late Roman times, into the 4th, 5th century, some of those disused rooms become a spot for a cemetery. And that's not uncommon. This happens at a lot of kind of out sites in the country. Parts of those complexes could be sort of reused as a cemetery into later phases of disuse and occupation of the site. So within that cemetery, it was an infant cemetery. So it means babies and infants were the primary things that were deposited. A couple styles of how they were put. In one, you could put them into an amphora, so a big sort of wine jug. They would crack it open along the sides and put the dead baby inside, put it back up. and then bury that into the ground. So they're not stuffing the baby down the spout of the amphora. They're cutting it open and putting it in. So two halves. Then you could have these alla cappuccina tombs, which are just these sort of little tent types tombs here, made of tiles. So a couple forms of burials for these babies. We had a short phase that many babies were dying. So it begged the question, well, what killed these babies at Luniano? Most likely, what we have here is a epidemic of malaria. We're all familiar now with different epidemics. They determined this from the skeletons of the babies that were there. They looked for signs of different stress in them. And a couple things were this cribra orbitalia, which is just sort of these sort of pockmark, sort of, pitted areas in the orbits of the skull, and parodic hyperostosis, which is just this term for kind of the bone itself is compromised. It's more parodic overall. So these tie up with stress. Stress could be anything, malnourishment, a variety of things could cause stress. They looked further and found that there was the DNA of the Plasmodium parasite, the pathogen that causes malaria. So there's a sort of more firm connection that malaria is involved as the cause of the stress for these babies overall. So within this, we've got 47 babies that were interred, that they recovered from the cemetery, but there were also puppies and bones of puppies that were sacrificed with the children. So the bones of the babies in the amphoras, or their little tent-like tombs, had bones of puppies with them as well. And you wonder, well, what is this? Is these puppies just the pet of these children? So that devotion of, I'm going to take the puppy into the afterlife is important? Well, perhaps, but death was a troublesome phase, especially for babies and infants in antiquity, in that certainly infant mortality was high in antiquity, and children, in some cases, weren't even named until their second year of life. So if they died at a phase of early, between 0 and 2, and they didn't have a name, they could be this unnamed spirit that could haunt the living. So to ensure that that wouldn't happen, that there'd be safe passage to the afterlife, the goddess Hecate was the one who ensured that transition from life to death for children, that safe passage to the afterlife of these unnamed souls. But she demanded sacrifice, and with that sacrifice was puppies, as you could guess, that had to be sacrificed to ensure the safe passage of these children. At this time, late antiquity, it's also a phase where Christianity is at play, and there are certainly many Christian symbols and ideas that Christian faith was around at Luniano. So why go back to this pagan idea of goddess Hecate and sacrifice to her? Well, it begs the question that in troubled times, in panic times, people will do whatever they need to do. In this case, let's try, when praying's not working, let's try this sacrifice to Hecate and see if she can stop this epidemic of malaria that's going through. So I noted that there are 47 infants. Well, we don't have 47 puppies there as well. There are only 22 puppies, so we have sort of half the number. And what has happened is that to ensure that puppies were with each baby, is some of these puppies were beheaded, bones taken out, or parts of them distributed with different infants. So no puppies were harmed in doctoring this image here. But certainly tells you that the connection of animals, puppies, with ritual was quite strong to ensure the successful movement of these babies to the afterlife. And the second study I want to examine is from Carthage, Tunisia. Carthage is sort of the capital of North Africa. It's located at the tip of Tunisia here, modern day Tunisia. Certainly Carthage is one of these sites that has had a lot of archaeological attention, the bulk of it in the 70s and 80s, sort of before the Arab uprising that happened. One of these sites that was excavated at Carthage is called this Yazmina necropolis. And you can see from the picture, this image here, I've got the circus, that's the racetrack where the horses ran, the amphitheater where you'd have the gladiator games, and then various little buildings that formed part of the city of Carthage, the houses, the market. Cemeteries in Roman times were outside of the city walls. So on the outskirts is where the cemeteries are. This cemetery was excavated by the University of Georgia under the directorship of Naomi Norman. They found it because a bulldozer was working in that area to build a road, and that bulldozer hit this statue, and that statue was of this charioteer. The arm got knocked off. The statue was buried. They didn't knock the statue up, but they stopped and said, we've got something under the ground here. Let's be cautious and do proper excavation. Sure enough, there was a cemetery beneath that, which had parts of it in its 2nd and 3rd century. It had a long life from the 2nd, 3rd up to the 4th, 5th century. It was used. In its earlier phases, it had these monumental tombs. So sort of these ashlar block bases on which would sit more sort of tiered things. And then on top, this isn't from Yasmin itself, but just gives you an idea of what some of these would have looked like. These little buildings on top that would inside house the urns for the cremations of the individuals. So that's in its height. In its 2nd and 3rd century, you get it as a cremation place. And then into the 4th, 5th century, it was used as an inhumation burial. So regular graves with the skeleton or the bodies put into it. Within that domain of different inhumation burials that were there, one stood out. It was a dog skeleton. It was in its own grave. So this wasn't a human with the dog put at its foot. This was a dog in its own burial. And to add to it, this dog had grave goods, and not that the others didn't, but among the value of the grave goods, this dog had the most valuable grave goods. So it got special treatment. It's a dog in a human cemetery, and it's a dog with more priceless things in its grave as its grave goods than the humans did. So there's something special. Let's look further at it. It was called this brachycephalic cranium. It had a very kind of bulbous head with a short snout. So it certainly fits with a small breed. Its stature, 20 to 21 centimeters for its withers. So it's a small sized dog. You can look at the bones in terms of how they're fused and the signatures on them that tell us it was elderly. It was beyond probably 10 years old, or even certainly towards the maximum age that dogs normally live. Most intriguingly, it had a whole series of different pathological conditions on the bones themselves. Dental loss, abscesses, it had infected teeth that had been fallen out, calculus, so the stuff that the dentist removes when they clean your teeth, arthritis, osteoarthritis, hip dislocation, osteoporosis, and more. So kind of among the things that can happen to our skeletons, this dog seemed to have all of them that were there. So a great case study in pathologies, but certainly pathologies are, let me rephrase, if something is ill with a lot of pathologies, normally it doesn't live, especially if it's an animal, unless it has extra care attached with it. So the fact that these are registering in such extreme levels denotes that something, someone, somehow, in some way, has given it extra attention. So let's look at a few of the pictures of these things. You can, if they make you queasy, look away. They're not that gruesome, but certainly those who study osteology things get very excited about pictures of pathological conditions. So you can see on its head, this is just its cranium. that normally there'd be teeth, but it doesn't have any teeth. All those teeth have been gone and the bone has absorbed and filled up the sockets where the teeth were there. So it's just got gums on its upper jaw. Its mandibles, the jaw bones itself, had lost all the teeth in the front, and the left one had 2 teeth, the right one only had 1, just 1 molar. And you can see that there's, periodontal disease, the roots are being exposed more, and all this sort of greenish brown stuff is tartar or plaque. So most times that sort of gets chipped away if your teeth can crunch with one another. That doesn't build up so much. But since this animal had no upper teeth, well, this plaque could build up on the lower teeth without it being hit or scraped away. Its scapula and humerus, so the things on its shoulder, you can see that got some extra bone growth here. It's exostosis. And then if you can see up in the articulation, so that part would affix to your shoulder blade here, your humerus, your upper arm. You can see that it's sort of flattened and polished. That's this, what we call eburnation. So the cartilage between the bone surfaces is absorbed away, and you got bone rubbing on bone. Painful, especially for those who might have advanced arthritis and know what I'm talking about. The left arm, same sort of thing, this advanced stage of eburnation, this polishing, and then this extra bone growth around the edges, really to try and stop it from moving, to hold it in. Its pelvis, so its legs. The left side certainly had marked eburnation as well, that polishing, and then these exostosis, this extra bone growth around here just to try and, it's hurting, so it wants to try and stop that movement of that joint. And on the right, you can see normally you only have 1 socket in which your femur, your hip bone, sits in there. Well, this has slipped and formed a 2nd socket, which is not normal, and done so at an early age, or certainly at a more advanced degree, for the formation of that extra socket. So this dog had mobility issues. Certainly its arms and legs moving would hurt, but it moved around, certainly with those conditions in play, to the point where it even built up a 2nd socket for its femur, for its leg bone on its right side. In its vertebrae, well, it had advanced osteoarthritis. The little spaces where the 2 vertebrae connect were pitted and striations and were compromised. And the bone itself, we see building this exostosis, this extra bone growth around the edges to try and stop and protect the vertebrae from moving around. And with that as well, we can see that normally your ribs aren't attached to your vertebrae, your backbone, but we see 1 rib that's been fused, and this is quite an advanced state, though this would be painful for this dog as its back is moving with that rib fused to the vertebrae themselves. So advanced arthritis and this ankylosing, this fusing of this rib are really just really advanced signs of pathological conditions for its back. So overall, we see advanced pathological conditions. Certainly this dog is living to a ripe old age with these things. For them to get to that state, well, it's walking, as we can see the polishing and the eburnation in play, and even the shift in the hip dislocation to get that extra socket. It has to eat, but how does it eat with no teeth or no upper teeth in play? Begs a lot of these questions about the care, the commitment. Someone has gone through great efforts to keep this dog alive, and a dog that shares a lot of pathological conditions on its bones overall. So small dogs, they certainly had status in antiquity, much the same way that people are taking around small dogs in their purses and showing them off, and people are oohing and aahing at these small dogs as they take them to different places. Small dogs in antiquity also are kind of the venerated, important, showy types of things, but dogs are also these things that have a curative or have a symbol about not just status, but also a symbol about health. The ancient sources discuss dogs licking their wounds, licking themselves, and through that, dogs have their own sort of self-curative type of property. So think of dogs certainly as status items and dogs as symbols of health. And this toy dog from the Yasmina Cemetery certainly is a pet in that extra care is devoted to it. Certainly great attention has been given to it, but it's also, one could say, the poster child of dogs as curative things. Here's one that lived with a whole range of skeletal problems, beat them all, I suppose, or was in that play to combat the ailments that were given to it. So here's special on a lot of fronts, this dog. Comparenda, for this case, are rare. We do get some small dogs at a couple other sites that get special treatment. Here's one from 4th century Leicester in the UK, where we get a small dog, not as small as the Yasmina one, but a dwarf type of breed, was given its own burial, but nothing to the degree of a huge array of skeletal troubles as the Yasmina dog had, and also that special treatment in terms of its burial. So this Yasmina dog is unique in terms of what it got, how it was treated, and what it tells us about that connection for care for a dog, pet dog in this case. One last point to add is that we noted that the dog had no teeth on its upper jaw and only a few teeth on the lower jaw. So it couldn't really masticate, it couldn't chew things properly. It would just be really gumming its food. So in terms of gnawing and biting, dogs chewing on bones or things like that, this dog couldn't do that, but it certainly needed to be fed, and it certainly would need that food to keep it alive for a long period of time. Archaeologists can play with different compounds that get interred in the bones themselves, and carbon and nitrogen are different chemical compounds that through their diet or what they're eating, how they're living, can materialize in different proportions in the animal skeletons themselves. And I won't go through all the details with carbon and nitrogen values, but I want to highlight that on the carbon scale across this way, 22 to 13, that correlates with different kinds of plants. So this dog had perhaps sorghum or millet or grain, different kinds of plants that might grow under different photosynthetic pathways. And that's less important for us, just might show some of these dogs had different kinds of grains or millets or different plant type things in its diet. Up the nitrogen scale, this one going vertically, we use it as a measure of trophic level. It just means in some cases, herbivores are lower on the trophic level, and then we move up to omnivores, and then we move up to carnivores. Just means that those higher up on that trophic level might have more, say, meat type in their diet. It's not as simple as that, but that could be a helpful thing to work with. So let's look at where these little dots are on the graph. And you can see that up on the higher end here are things that are from North African sites, Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, and some of that could be some of these higher nitrogen values can also relate to ecosystem variation. So drier places might actually have a higher nitrogen concentration. But notwithstanding all of those, what we get at the very top is Yasmina. So that little toy dog, in terms of its nitrogen value, is the highest among all of the comparative values we have here. Could be, well, this dog then had perhaps its greater equivalent in its diet of ate meat. And you can think of, what do dogs like to eat? Meat. What would they prefer? Meat. This little dog certainly had some ground up processed meat. So the equivalent of our Alpo food from the dog, prime Alpo food, or the best, blue ribbon diet processed food that may be for dogs today. This Yasmina dog had that in antiquity. So overall, something special, not only in its care, but also in its diet as well. So close up, certainly it tells us that this bond between the pet and owner is strong. One wonders, well, how were the ancients like us? And I think the more we sort of tap into the emotions of the ancient people, the more we can connect the past and the present. And I think this particular example tugs at those heartstrings. Here's a dog, which many of us can maybe relate to, how much we go overboard for our pets today in some cases. And that same kind of commitment shows up in this archaeological case study from this Yasmina dog. So it bonds the past and present. It shows that those ways to animate and activate the past are really important to promote it as an important thing to understand, and to show that as much as Romans may have done things differently on some aspects, they were the same. And this emotional bond could be one way in which, in some cases, they shared similarities. So that Roman past, certainly there's a dog from Pompeii, one of the molded types of cavities in the soil in which they poured in the plaster to make the dog. And then Roman present, certainly there's a connection between these two times, especially in terms of emotional treatment for some animals. So ultimately, think of never sort of underestimate the emotion that you feel when you see this, and probably said, that animal has domesticated you. And perhaps that same kind of feeling that we have connected with it today was around in some cases in antiquity as well, and certainly shows up in the Yasmina case study for that tight bond that the animal shared with its master, owner, whomever was in charge of it in antiquity. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'm back on yet, Michael. Thank you very much for a great presentation, very endearing. While people type questions at the end, I have one to begin with. I'm not sure if you've seen it. I think it was in the news last week. There was reports, can't remember if I read it on CNN or whatnot, a discovery of a pet dog. I think it was in Roman antiquity, but what was special about that one is that they had either a collar or a necklace. And they said that was the special thing about it. Unfortunately, I haven't read the whole news article, so I'm not sure what was so special about that. I was wondering if you knew anything about that research and could share something about the significance of that find.
Yeah, I haven't read that particular article about I'll have to check into the CNN reports with it. But certainly collars on dogs are that extra step of control with it. And certainly within those things, one could decorate the collar, make it more expensive, put on, they bring diamonds, but certainly you get the idea of certainly the more investment one puts with that, the more it shows off a symbolism of control, number one, but also a showiness, ostentatiousness, or messaging to other people about that's special. I've gone and delivered more for this dog. And I can, at least with collars and things that they can put on it, they can show that message more directly to others.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of antiquity is about, one-upmanship across different social groups. And the more ways that they could do this, often they did it through dinner parties and other things to show off. But it's a game to a certain degree. The more ways you can do it, and if pets can be involved in that and showing things within the pet, not just I'm going to feed my pet a special food that you might not be able to see. I'm going to decorate and show this animal, even in terms of little houses or dog houses that they put around the Roman houses. There's a means in which they could show off on that as well.
So in other words, what we see today as like Hollywood socialites who basically have carried their pet dog. I don't want to name anyone because I don't want to be sued, but basically that also happened in ancient Rome, basically.
Oh, exactly. Yep. And even within that, there's some, the ancient texts talk about that, mentioned this healing property of dogs overall. And small toy dogs could be held close to one's body, in which case some of those curative properties could be transferred more readily. So there's something more special about these dogs being portable, carrying them, that would add to that, health benefit too. So, and then add that's now I can show that I'm doing this. So you get double messaging. Hey, I get the benefit, and I also get the social benefit of everyone seeing this. So a lot of symbolism tied up in these things that isn't always expressed concretely in our sources, but the more we use our archaeological evidence to add to it, the more we can get sort of at the nuances, the many dimensions of how these things were in play.
Mm-hmm. Oh, awesome. I see we have a few questions coming in. One question from Jim. He was wondering if the Carthage dog or any other buried dogs show any indication of veterinary style interventions, such as splinted, broken legs or extracted teeth.
That Yasmina dog, the Carthage one doesn't, but there are cases of, I did an article about sort of the treatment of just regular dogs, and do we have things for splinting, for extracted teeth? Extracted teeth, less so. There are a couple examples of animals that had their legs splinted in order to take a severe fracture alignment and then try and work with it. But in terms of advanced veterinarian types of procedures, they are discussed somewhat in the ancient sources, but the priority for that really is for horses. So they get top treatment, dogs get some of this treatment, and then actual signs of how this is expressed in our archaeological record are rare, but there are some cases of severe malalignments has been remedied by a crude type of splint.
Okay.
Whether or not the dog liked it or not is another story, but people are trying. So there's investment in that way.
Okay. We have another question from Jack. He's asking, is there any evidence of enrichment for dogs in the archaeological record? For example, ropes and balls used as toys for dogs.
Yeah, there's not a wide array, and it's difficult to I guess pinpoint. Well, we get ropes, different pieces of ropes that show up, but a connection of the rope with the dog that's secure with a gnaw mark on the rope that ties up with the dentition of a dog. We don't have that accuracy yet, but I would imagine that yes, these things exist. The connection that's there, at least they're not specific enough to say that this is a special dog toy versus a toy that any child or anything could have worked with. So it's a good question. And I think as we venture forward, I hope that kind of more of those concrete types of connections can be there and certainly more scientific procedures to maybe see on that ceramic vessel scratch marks, gnaw marks from a dog that tie up with, not just it with a pet dog going at it, rather than this was thrown to the junkyard and the dogs got at it later on.
I guess some of those potential toys also, if they're like made of soft material, maybe depending on the type of grounds, that could
Exactly.
decay and not be preserved as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So certainly, I'm sure they're giving bones to these dogs all the time. We've got gnaw marks on bones from sites, whether or not that's the beef bone you gave to the dog to play with or to chew, versus these were bones that were thrown in the garbage later on, and the dogs from the alleyway got at it. You can't tell in those circumstances, but certainly, and yeah, preservation is always an issue. So things that were organic or soft or didn't preserve, that dogs might have chewed on as a toy, wouldn't be there in the record.
Yeah, okay. We have a question maybe in the same line from Allison. She's asking, were there any grave goods associated with the Yasmina dog grave?
Right. There was this little glass vestal, a little sort of small little unguentariums, just like a little perfume type vessel. We get those across graves. They're often sort of a standard grave good, but for a grave of a dog to have something that's typically with humans, and then the cost of the one that went into that dog, the glass vessel, was a highly rare and specialized one. So it got something that shows up across other sites, but it got a special form of it. And it got something better than the humans. So that, stands out overall, that this dog is ranking higher than the humans in the graveyard.
Mm-hmm. We have two questions, one from Tony, one from Barry, asking, is there any evidence that there were vets, professional vets or amateur vets in the ancient Rome to take care of pets?
Yes, there weren't. We get veterinary manuals that were written in the ancient sources. I said the bulk of that gets tied up with horses and equids, so they were more valuable. And even, there are some veterinary treatments of guidelines for the farmer to work with different signs of illness in his livestock. In terms of professional vets coming, not in the same way of human doctors or doctors that are working on humans. And even then, kind of the world of medicine antiquity was not as valued as we might put it today. So often slaves are doing these types of things. So this isn't sort of a prestigious occupation, in which case if it's lower on that social order, it doesn't get remarked upon as much in the ancient sources. To give us an idea of doctors' offices and nurses and all those types of attendants, and formalized places in the archaeological record, a doctor's office with nameplates and all these things, don't show up to the degree that that they do today. So because yes, there were professionalized individuals who practiced medicine for both humans and animals. The animal ones on a lower tier, and certainly because they're tied up more with slaves or lower class citizens, they're represented less overall in our record.
Oh, I see. We have two questions related to the burial site you mentioned, where dogs were buried alongside babies who had died from malaria. A question from Femke and one from Darren, asking, first, how can we tell if a dog was sacrificed? And the follow-up would be, from that site, is it possible to identify if the dogs were buried preferentially with boys or girls, or is it impossible to say?
Yeah, the boys and girls part is well, it's not impossible. Certainly we could do DNA testing on the bones to determine the sex. Unfortunately for that site, well, they didn't have a limited budget to do that. And some of the stuff they did was before some of the advancements with some of those techniques for DNA work. And infant skeletons, it's difficult to determine sex from them from just a visual standpoint, because the bones haven't developed the kind of dimorphic, the male-female type characteristics that might show up in the mature skeleton. So connecting male-female with different things is difficult, although, and then the second part was the...
if we can tell, how he can tell that a dog was sacrificed, as opposed to being buried because it died.
Right. The dogs were in with the amphora and in with the little tent-like tombs. So there's a deliberate human effort to put the dog there. So most likely it's not sort of an accident that the dog got in there later on, or things filtered through from shuffling of the earth, and this dog and these bones got in there through geological or natural processes. And in some cases there's there's a breakage pattern on the, you take the skull and the mandible and you could pry the head open. There's a special breakage pattern on how the bones are that show that it had been physically ripped, and jawbone put, or a head put in with the individual. So there was human effort to manipulate these dogs, and then human effort to physically put the pieces in, which couldn't kind of be a chance type of reshuffling of the earth to get these things in.
Oh, okay. Someone related to the topic is asking about cats. Is there any evidence of cat burials similar to what's happening at that site, where cats maybe were sacrificed or buried with kids?
No, as far as we don't have secure evidence of cat. Well, in Rome, certainly cats with Egyptian stuff, there's cat mummies, there's all that veneration. So that's a different story. When you move to the Greeks and the Romans, there isn't a secure soul cat burial parallel like the Yasmina one. So we don't have number one, I'm not aware of cats in with people in a graveyard, even as you might put a dog at the foot of the person. We don't have the similar kind of a cat at the foot of the person as this pet cat. So none of that. And then certainly nothing to the degree of a cat in its own grave, in with humans overall. We get the odd cat thrown on a garbage dump here or there, the odd cat, scattered around in different spots around a site, but nothing that shows a deliberate attention of putting a cat memorialized in a burial. So much of it is just, as I said, the cats weren't considered pets, even though some could be there, but certainly not to the degree that dogs were.
I see.
So kind of a one in a 1,000 or 1 in a million type of scenario.
Oh, awesome. Sorry, I'm scrolling through lots of questions. Is there any evidence that dogs had special working role in society at that time, like herding or protection of people or property?
Yes, lots of that. Certainly, dogs had multiple roles, and I think their principal roles were for, a guard dog. Look at the Cave Canem mosaic in Pompeii, where the mosaic of the dog at the front steps. Beware of the dog. So lots of that. Lots of dogs with hunting. Lots of dogs with shepherding. So I think the primary purpose of dogs overall was that work field. And certainly as the sizes of these things show, it's more that protection, guard, and working were the size categories first manipulated to make them bigger, stronger, more powerful. And I suppose once they had a secure footing with that, then the Romans played more around with the toy dogs at the other end, the small end of the spectrum. So yeah, their chief purpose was that. And certainly size-wise, more of the finds we find are from the middle to large size dogs, which presumably were for hunting, shepherding, guarding, those standard work roles.
Oh, okay. We have a question from Ian. Do ancient sources discuss different opinions on the incorporation of pets into the household? Did some people regard it as morally dubious?
Oh, I don't know about morally dubious. But, I think it certainly said that if the world of Roman antiquity in particular was this sort of showy one-upmanship type of thing. So pets got immersed in that as a symbolic means to show off wealth. So you could do that by having something that's different from your neighbors, a small one, a special breed, a large one, one with a special coat or color. So I think the more opportunities to display in that fashion promoted this message that it's not, I suppose, there's no negatives, I suppose, in keeping the animals that way. So for it to be sort of morally dubious or, moving into sort of salacious type of things or bad behaviors, or people are going to look down on you for certain kinds of animals, I think that's less of a factor overall.
Okay. Yeah, someone's also asking, are there ancient texts or ancient books preserved that would have been the equivalent of how to take care of your pets in ancient antiquity?
Yes and no. Certainly there are, we have one sort of this veterinarian writer, Vegetius, who writes about mostly horses, but also, dogs are sprinkled in there. And then we get farm manuals that talk about proper ways to keep animals on the farm. So mostly they talk about here's how to raise your chickens and your cattle and your pigs, and feed them this way, shear the wool at this season. It's more practical stuff that way. But immersed within that are here's proper ways to keep your hunting dogs fed and cared for. A good diet for a hunting dog would be, or for the puppies of the hunting dog, feed them first with bread that's soaked with milk. So there are these kind of how-to guides. The degree to which these how-to guides were disseminated in print is small. Most ancient texts, literacy was reduced in antiquity, and there were no huge printing presses, so it's not like you get mass distribution of these how-to farming manuals that every farmer got. Most cases, these would be elite farmers would have these as some means to show off or have some guidance, and the tactics or the things that they prescribed would really just be word of mouth that people would get. I heard from so-and-so the best way to feed the puppies is to do this. So that oral dissemination of information was probably the how the bulk of things got disseminated for care of animals overall, and trial and error, I suppose, is too.
A few more questions about the use of dogs. Is there proof that dogs were manipulated, like cutting off their tails or modifying in some way? And is there evidence that pets were used in the ancient games in ancient Rome?
Yeah, in terms of the manipulation part, there are a couple cases that they think they've determined the docking of the tail. So they cut the tail off, and then they see how the vertebrae at those last few ones had developed and fused. So there are a couple that I'm aware of where that has been proposed. It's difficult to get at it concretely, but certainly there probably was that manipulation and doctoring on that level. Breeding, yeah, there's lots of information that they manipulated them to as I said, get dachshund-looking ones, wiener dog-looking one, big ones with big heads and small snouts or more powerful jaws. So all of the things that you could do in terms of the size and shape variation are in play for Roman antiquity. So certainly they didn't know anything about, they didn't know the genetics behind it, but they knew if I take this big one and breed it with this small one, I might get something in between. If I get two powerful ones, I'm going to get a powerful one as well. So they played around with that to adapt their dogs, most especially to get a variety of them overall. And the part about
were pets used in the ancient games?
Yeah, not well. Certainly, yes, to a certain degree, but more so if there was in the amphitheater with the gladiator, the bestiary, the people that are hunting the wild animals, hunting dogs could be used in that scenario. So think of, I'm going to stage a fight and I'm going to have a gladiator hunter guy with his dogs going after the bears and the deer that were in the amphitheater. So these sort of staged fights were part of the games in antiquity. Technically gladiators only fought gladiators, so no gladiators would really go after wild animals. That's sort of these what are called bestiarii, these specialized fighters who only fought wild animals. So contrary to Hollywood and all those things where they show, the gladiator going after the cheetah or the lion, he wouldn't be called a gladiator if he's fighting an animal. And dogs and cats in those things, well, certainly the big cats were around, but most of those things, and I could have wrote a separate article, I could go on and on about all this stuff as well, but beware of the, as I said, that antiquity was this world where showiness was important. So Emperor's account, I sponsored a game that had 1,000 elephants and a million tigers. That's exaggeration. Doesn't mean that they're telling the truth. It's fake news. We can use common concepts. The bone record for these things shows that there are few and far between zooarchaeological evidence for those massive cats, elephants, all the big things from amphitheater excavations in antiquity. So the bone evidence doesn't show us the same degree of what's recounted in the ancient sources in terms of the numbers and in terms of the variety. So no huge big cats, elephants. So probably in most cases they were local deer and bear, things they could get locally that were collected, and then the bestiarii, these wild beast hunters, would hunt them in the amphitheater and put on a show for the people.
I think you answered a few questions. People were asking about exotic animals and their role in ancient Rome. So you answered those questions. That's great. We have a few questions about, is there any indication, that's probably outside of pre-Rome, but basically about, is there any indication about the domestication of dogs, when it would have started based on the archaeological finds?
Yeah, they go back to, even prior to the domestication of plants, 10,000 BC in earlier phases. So dogs were the earliest of the animals domesticated, at least in the old world. And there are multiple theories. I think that the best one is probably that as people settled down, they built up different garbage piles around their settlements. The dogs, wild dogs, wolves would come in to munch on those garbage things around that settlement. Initially they probably tried to shoo them away and keep them away, but were less successful at that, in which case, as they become more tolerant of the dogs rummaging around the garbage in their backyard, that leads to that sort of symbiotic relationship of the dogs and the humans relying on one another. They could take some of these and domesticate them, use them for other purposes. They tolerated the dogs around. So, then that would just build up that kind of that symbiosis, that connection of the dogs and the humans coming together. So that seems to be the most, at least in my opinion, the most kind of promising of the theories for domestication of dogs ultimately.
Awesome. We have only 3 questions left, if that's okay with you, if you have a few more minutes.
Yes.
We have a question from Darren. Could it be that the Roman-aged children are shown with small dogs because they are safer around children? I would not want my young children around a large dog for safety reasons.
Yeah, makes sense. That's a good point. Yes, although I've had some small dogs that can be quite vicious. So certainly that can be added to the mix. But I think some of these other theories I think the one about the the Romans, as much as they sort of were showy, they were also kind of formalized in how things should be. There was a message about how to symbolize stuff. So I think some of this idea of that, I can't put a small person with a big dog because the scale is off and people will think what's going on. I think some of that probably was more on the minds of individuals as they were putting those images together, as opposed to maybe some of these ideas of small ones are tamer, cuter, and I just wouldn't want a big dog around a small person. Mm-hmm. But it's a good point, and certainly one that I'll follow up more if we could get at some of those from our limited archaeological evidence.
Yeah. Awesome. We have a question now talking about birds from Anne. I've seen images of odd ancient bird cages that look like a round cage on its side, birds inside, and this turning crank on one side. What's up with that? Something to force the birds to continue flying for show?
Yeah, I don't know about the specific one with the crank, but I'd certainly, there are these aviaries. So certainly there are bird cages that were around in antiquity, some small, some large, and sort of that people were mesmerized by birds. So I could see moving from that, some people who would manipulate sort of a standard type size cage for whatever other purpose they wanted, be it I'm going to put little swings in this or cranks or all sorts of other things that could incite or at least display these birds that I'm keeping in this cage in a more kind of fantastic light. I don't know of many archaeological examples of these things themselves, but as I said, I wouldn't put it past the ancients in Rome to try any and every type of variety with it to get the birds to perform.
Oh, I missed one question that came a different box. Sorry, I'll ask it. Any testing of the unguent in Yasmina, as in, can we tell if it was a scent used to cover up the smell coming from the mouth?
Probably not. Some of the unguentari, these little glass vessel perfume vial type things that were there, they're not, I suppose. Perfume could be one thing that could be put into it. You could put a whole, different oils and scents and other things within it. So I suppose connecting it specifically with a perfume to cover up the smell of the mouth is possible, but probably not probable in this case, because we don't know what type of substance was in it. They haven't done a residue analysis of the vessel to determine, it could have been empty for years with nothing in it at the time of the death of the dog, or they could have put water in it, or they could have put milk in it. So we don't know exactly what was put in that specific vial. Okay. A curious point to add to the problems to figure out later.
Yeah. Last question. It's about more educational material. Anki is asking, what are some educational texts or journals you may be able to recommend, especially for elementary students, K to 12, perhaps who are interested in studying pet animals in Roman time?
The younger, and I don't have a specific one for that age group. I'm unfortunate. I guess a lot of the stuff I'm reading is for the
technical
groups, but a quick internet search is going to get you lots of I think National Geographic Kids is probably a good source that will highlight different cultures, and I know they have ones for Egypt and Rome, and I think within that you can probably get more popularized accounts for animal life in Rome. And I know there are some often different museums have kind of children's series books that get connected with them. Within that, I know that at Athens, the site of the Athenian Agora, sort of right below where the Parthenon, where the big temples are, this is a site that's been excavated by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens for 75 years. And they have a series of kind of pocket books about life in the Agora. And one of those is about animals, and one of them is about daily life. So I think if you go to some of the big excavation sites or big museums, most often they will have some sort of popularized series that can help.
Awesome. Well, I think that answers all our questions. Thank you so much, Michael, for your generosity and all your time answering our questions. It was a very fascinating talk. It's fun to see that, same principles of taphonomy, preservation, and pathologies are basically the same. Same between archaeology and paleontology. So that was great. So thank you again for a great presentation. And I'd like to also thank everyone for joining in and for asking questions. And I'll invite you to come next week. Our next speaker will be Dr. Karma Nenglu. He's a paleontologist at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, National Museum of Natural History, in Washington, D.C. And he's going to be talking about Burgess Shale animals, so some of the ancient 550 plus or minus 20 million years soft-bodied animals that are preserved in the mountains of BC, so giving us an idea of what life was like at the bottom of the ocean nearly 500 million years ago. So if that's interests you, come back next week. I think the link for registration for the next talk is already up. If not, it's going to be available on the website and be advertised via social media. So again, thank you all for coming. And again, thank you so much, Michael. Hopefully we get to meet one another in person after the pandemic, and good luck with your research.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.